And you can kind of compare this to putting on some eyeglasses when you want to look at a particular subject. We've looked at some subjects before, whether it's God, whether it's the law. We've noticed the great relationship between the sanctuary and the great controversy theme. And last Tuesday night, we kind of were shining a light on the subject of the church. And so if you want to look at these like eyeglasses, then when you look through this, you can have a better understanding kind of what the church is all about. But we're only doing this in a very limited sense, And so when we started this, we noticed that the things that occur up in the heavenly sanctuary take on a very universal application. And this is what we found when we studied about the church just last week. And so just a little bit of a review. Of course, a church without God or without members or without some ministry or some organization is really not a church. So those are the building components. We were specifically looking at who constitutes the members of the church in our presentation last week. And if you'll remember, the members of the church not only include those of us here on earth, but also who else? The ones in heaven as well. They constitute one church. Now this has a lot of implications. So we won't go through all the proofs that we already went through last time, like Isaiah 14 and Hebrews chapter 12, verse 23, which is a really, really good one. It tells us that when we're gathered together in a corporate sense, that we're ultimately gathered around, we're in the New Jerusalem, so to speak. We're like transported almost to the New Jerusalem, just like it says in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 16, let us come boldly to the throne of grace. Well, we don't literally travel up there, but we're pictured as if we're right there and our petitions are being made right in the presence of God. Same principle when we talk about corporate worship. We are there not around Mount Sinai, but around the heavenly Jerusalem to an innumerable company of angels. We've come to God, the judge of all the earth, to the firstborn ones, to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, to the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel. We are in God's presence. This is a universal church made up of members, not just earthly, but also heavenly. It actually uses the word church there in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 23. So just to kind of refresh your memory just on that, Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 23, it actually uses the word church in that context when it says in verse 23 that we are gathered to the general assembly and church of the firstborn ones which are written in heaven. All right? So that means that the church is a universal church comprised of members that make up those here on earth and also those in heaven. And so we went through a little bit of this in Revelation 19:10. You remember what the angel tells John when John is about to worship him? He says, don't do it. Why? Because, and he uses a particular word that denotes a family. He says, he referred to himself as a fellow servant and brother. Okay, and that's what we refer to each other as. We refer to each other as brothers and sisters. And the angel is saying, I'm your fellow servant and of your brethren. And that's just terminology to note that we're part of the same huge, big family. And then love this verse, Ephesians 3, verse 14 and 15. For this reason, I bow my knees to the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, from whom the whole family in heaven and earth is named. So the family is composed of members. Those members are located on earth, and those members are located in heaven, and there's only one family. And the bombshell quote in the Testimonies, Volume 6, page 366, the church of God below is one with the church of God above. Believers on the earth and the beings in heaven who have never fallen constitute one church. Amazing, amazing statement. Amazing statement. And so, there are some implications for this. So what are the implications for this? In other words, what is the result of this? What kind of dominoes are going to drop as a result of the fact that the church is really a universal church instead of just in some corner of the globe here? Well, there's one universal family. There's not many families in the sense of contradiction. There's just one family, and although we might look different, we might come from different places, but it is the blood of the Lamb. It is the word of our testimony. This is what helps us to be part of that family. There's one throne that we're all gathered around. That means there's one universal standard that's applicable to all of us. Doesn't matter where we come from, whether we're heaven or earth, one universal standard affects all of us. And of course, the throne is symbolic of the Ten Commandments. As you look at Revelation chapter 11:19, the temple of God was opened, and as soon as it was opened, we saw the Ark of His Testament, and of course the law is deposited there, and that's associated with God's throne. There's only one plan that unites heaven and earth. You know, when you think of the plan of salvation, there are really two focal points according to the sanctuary. One is the altar of burnt offering, where antitypically Jesus offered Himself up on the cross. But then the other one is the Day of Atonement, and that doesn't happen down here. That happens up there. And so that adds to the whole idea that this plan is a universal plan uniting heaven and earth. We'll get to some of those passages, maybe not today, but maybe on another time, just depending on just how quickly we go. All right, so one family, one throne, one standard, one plan that unites heaven and earth. This is the area that I'm working on now. There's one universal form of worship, not many contradictory forms. There's one template kind of that has been given to us, and I wish I had some statements here, and I should have them on the spirit of prophecy on Revelation chapters 4 and 5. Really, really powerful. You know, we usually concentrate on the chapters like, you know, the beasts and the woman in Revelation 12 and Revelation 13 and Revelation 14 and 17, and we really concentrate on those, but there's a whole lot in Revelation chapters 4 and 5. As a matter of fact, many of the themes that are found there, many of the symbols, the images, whether it's the throne, the 24 elders, the 4 living creatures, the angels, you find those all in all other types of chapters in the book of Revelation. So there's one universal form of worship and not many contradictory forms, all right? I'll give you just a small glimpse of that. If you turn to Revelation chapter 4, well, I'll probably be in. That's kind of like the introduction, where the door is open and John sees one seated on the throne, and then you have 4 living creatures and 24 elders surrounding the throne, and they start praising Him because He's the Creator. That's what it says in Revelation 4, verse 8, roughly 8 to 10. And then you find in Revelation chapter 5, I saw in the right hand of Him that sat on the throne a book written within and on the backside, sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the book and to loose the seals thereof?" And John is looking in every direction, and no one is found worthy. Well, then all of a sudden, you jump down to verse 6, and he beholds a lamb as it had been slain in the middle of the verse, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent forth into all the earth. Now, as soon as the Lamb had taken that book in verse 8 of chapter 5, you find just amazing joy being expressed here. The 4 beasts, the 24 elders, fell down before the Lamb, having every one of them harps and golden vials full of odors, which are the prayers of the saints, and they sung a new song. And the words are recorded there in verse 9 and 10. And then, as they sing, it swells out into an even greater chorus in verse 11, because the angels are singing now, and the number of them is 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands of thousands. And what are they saying? The words are recorded in verse 12. "Worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power and riches and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and blessing." And then just as if, and the circle widens even more in verse 13, where it says, "Every creature which is in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and such as are in the sea, and all that are in them heard I saying, Blessing and honor and glory and power be unto him that sitteth upon the throne and unto the Lamb forever and ever. So in this worship scene, the unrolling of the scroll is really where the universe's attention is at. The music is wonderful, but the music is in response to the reception of the scroll. And John, plus the onlooking universe, really want to know what is in that scroll. It must have something to do with the great controversy, and it is of great importance. And so John is really wondering about that. And they want to know what's in it. And it's only as the Lamb takes that scroll, then there is this sublime music that is pouring forth in amazing currents and themes. And so music is the response. It's not front and center. Now, in the charismatic movement, music is front and center. It's absolutely reversed. In the Roman Catholic Church, it is the Mass that is front and center. So it is not the promulgation of the Word. It's the high point is the Mass. And you realize this when you head into a Catholic basilica, because the architecture points out that it is in a central location. Not only is it in a central location, but it is ornately decorated with the most costly materials to let you know this is the most important thing in this worship service when the priest lifts up the wafer and says, "This is my body," in which allegedly the substance of the divine and human Son of God is transubstantiated in the wafer there. So this scene contradicts what they would consider as being front and center, because that's not what's going on here. Front and center is what's in that scroll. I want to know what's in that scroll. So it must be written in like God language that nobody understands, that nobody can read, except for the Lamb. He's the only one qualified. So the charismatic model is out, and so is the Roman Catholic model. And there are other churches as well that have the Eucharist, or we don't refer to it that way, the Lord's Supper, as front and center. It's really the unrolling of the scroll that is front and center, and music is given as a response to that. So the music doesn't actually kick in until the seals begin to be broken, and then the music sets in, and so forth and so on. And so there's really kind of one template. And notice you don't have all these different cultures having contradictory services. You have all the cultures, not just in the world, but all the cultures in the universe in verse 13, because it says every creature which is in heaven and on earth. Right, so that you can't get much more universal than that. All ages too, yeah, that's another thing. And by the way, you can read many Old Testament passages, and when there was something of great importance, they gathered everybody together. Yes, all ages were there. Absolutely. Okay. There's one central storehouse in heaven where the tithe is returned. Now, I haven't really developed this theme, and it's quite a hot potato, of course. But the entire premise is this, and that is the model and the template that has been given to us is really up in heaven. And there's a passage in the book of Hebrews, chapter 7, if you'll turn there, Hebrews chapter 7, where the apostle compares the priesthood of Melchizedek to Jesus, because Jesus didn't come from the line of Aaron. He came from Judah. And so how can he be the high priest? Well, because his priesthood is after Melchizedek. And as the apostle compares the priesthood of Aaron with that of Melchizedek, and then referring to Christ, in verse 8 it says, "And here," meaning here on earth, "men that die receive tithes, but there he receiveth them, of whom it is witnessed that he liveth." All right, so whatever we do down here is really being pictured as if it's done up there. Again, in Hebrews chapter 12, when we gather around for corporate worship, we're actually pictured as if we were gathering around the central throne up in heaven, much like the children of Israel, when they gathered for worship, they went to Jerusalem where the literal temple was, and they gathered there. We're actually pictured as if we're doing that. So everything we're doing is really unto the Lord in that sense, and we receive the template from there. So I think there's some merit to that. If you go to Old Testament texts, like for instance, I'll take you to one in Deuteronomy chapter 12. We can go to Deuteronomy chapter 12, and you'll notice that the place where God chooses to reveal himself is central when it comes to the gathering of the children of Israel, when it comes to the sacrifices where they're to be brought, and when it comes to the tithes as well. Notice what it says in Deuteronomy chapter 12. I don't have the exact verse here. Okay, it mentions free will offerings in verse 6. Let's see. Yes, it's in verse 11. Okay, so we're going to focus on verse 11, but I'm going to jump back to verse 5 of Deuteronomy 12. It says, "But unto the place which the Lord your God shall choose out of all your tribes to put his name there," that means he's going to be present there, "even unto his habitation shall you seek, and thither shalt thou come." And notice in verse 6, and thither, in other words, there you will bring your burnt offerings, your sacrifices. Oh, your tithes, it was right there. Your tithes and your heave offerings of your land, and your vows and your freewill offerings, and the firstlings of your herds and of your flocks. So in other words, they were to return their tithe to the place where God chose to reveal himself. And that's what happened in the Old Testament period. So they were all together, and then they returned it there because that was the place where God was revealing himself. All right. Now, what about now when, as Jesus was being sacrificed, the Bible tells us that the curtain of the temple was rent in two from top to bottom, thus signifying that type is meeting antitype. And when he said, "Behold, your house is left unto you desolate," the divine presence would no longer manifest itself to God's people on earth in the same way that it had in the past, whether it was the Shekinah glory in the past or Christ as the desire of all nations coming. Now he's dead and now he's up in heaven. Okay. So God is actually speaking to us from up there. He's actually speaking to us from the heavenly sanctuary. We covered this in a text in the book of Hebrews chapter 12. And so if you keep your finger there, Hebrews chapter 2, there we go. All right, that's where we were. So we're going to keep I'm going to try to keep my finger there. There we go. And I'm going to go to, because God is speaking to us from heaven. And just like he would speak to us when he was on earth, but how is he speaking to us? Remember, in the book of Hebrews, it says God speaks in various ways. And one of the ways that he speaks is by the actions that he performs as our high priest up there. In verse 24 of Hebrews 12, it says, "When we're gathered together for corporate worship, we are come to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel." Now, this is a sanctuary scene, so the blood of sprinkling refers to the ritual actions that the high priest would perform on that day of atonement. This refers to the actions that Jesus is performing as our high priest in working in the heavenly sanctuary, in blotting out of sin, and uniting us to himself. This is a form of speech. And so as God is speaking up there, then we are worshiping down here, and we are responding, and we are then returning our tithes and our offerings. And I know we bring them here, but we're pictured as if we're kind of bringing them up there. All right, so that's kind of the thought. I don't know whether anybody has any thoughts on that. But anyway, you guys are the guinea pigs, so I'm just kind of throwing it out. So I don't see any tomatoes coming, so all right. So far, so good. But these are just kind of some of the implications. So as soon as you begin to think on, okay, if the church is a universal church, how does it affect our worship? How does it affect our returning of tithes? How does it affect, some of these other things that we're talking about? Let's see if I have any more. Decisions in the heavenly sanctuary are not okay, this is a little, get me in hot water here. Yes. So they're not decided by, one group in heaven as opposed to any, they're universal decisions, are they not? And they are to be applied universally. And that should be followed by us down here. Now, you really need to read this, Matthew chapter 16, verse 18. And if you look in the Seventh-day Adventist Bible commentary, it's going to break down for you grammatically how this should read. All right? So just don't take my word for it. Matthew chapter 16, verses 18 and 19. Okay. And it says here, "And I say unto thee also that thou art Peter, and upon this rock," like the Greek word for Peter is Petros, and the Greek word for rock is Petra, which is a big, huge, immense rock. So he's saying, okay, you're Peter, but upon this rock, this Petra, referring to himself, I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth. Now, this is how it should read according to the Greek grammar rules. And you can find this, and I can pull it up for you, and you can see it in the Adventist Bible commentary on this text. This is how it should read. Whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. And whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. All right, so it's so the principles of governance, the principles that are to be applied are heavenly principles. So it's not like the church can decide to do whatever it wants to do. Its authority is not an independent authority. Its authority is one that is derived, actually, from what's taking place in heaven, from Christ's authority in heaven, etc., etc. All right, so these decisions should be universal in nature as well. Okay, so these are just maybe some implications of some of this. And so it does raise some questions regarding ministerial practice and regard to worship as well, because we're being affected on a worldwide scale, and especially here in North America, we're being very much affected worship-wise by the charismatic movement, very much so. Okay, and that's one of the things that I take on in the book. All right. Okay, so now that if the church, we're moving to something else now. So I don't know if anybody has a comment or a question. Yes, Ollie has Jerry's.
Yeah, so when the Bible says, is it Ephesians? One Lord, one faith, one doctrine,
Ephesians 4,
one God,
yep.
one Father, whatever. That's fitting with this. Basically, wherever we try to freelance or say, well, locally our style is, our culture is, we're not putting ourselves in submission to God's one way. We're not interested to find out if our way is His way or not.
Yeah. Right. So the only thing we have in the Bible is that universal scene in Revelation 4 and 5, and all the cultures, all the ages are all represented there, heavenly and earthly. So it seems to form a big, massive template. And it answers some basic questions. And what I need to do is develop a bunch of, how we have Bible study lessons, question, answer. Now that the book has been written, and now I can kind of move in that direction to see, to take on some of these questions and issues. All right, very good. Oops. I don't know if anyone else has a comment or a question. If not, we will move forward. Okay, now that if when looking through the sanctuary we find that the church is a universal church, then in a very narrow way, how does this help us to understand the universal definition of what sin is? Well, I guess I gave you the hint that it should be a universal definition. That's a hint. And so I discovered, I came about this, not by looking at all the texts on the word sin, but I came about this by saying, okay, the heavenly sanctuary points to a universal church. That means that there are members in heaven that the church is composed of that are heavenly and then earthly. And we all know what happened in heaven in Revelation chapter 12, right? There was a war in heaven and some got booted out. All right, so they must have sinned. All right, so how does the universal concept of the church affect how we understand this definition of sin? So I'm looking at it in a very narrow sense in this way, because there are basically two views. Why do we sin today? Well, we sin because we inherited a sinful nature, and if you just remove that, then that will take care of the entire sin problem. So what is the cause? Well, it's the fact that I have a sinful nature. Okay. But what we find is that that doesn't pass the universality test, because there were folk in heaven that don't have that and that didn't have that, but yet they sinned. How is it that that could happen? So it really doesn't pass the universality test. And so I want you to turn to 2 Peter for a moment. And so I reasoned in my mind that on this basis, there must be a universal definition that applies to not just humans, but also to angels. And then voila, there it was in 2 Peter chapter 2. So let's turn to there, even though I've got some of it up on the screen. I want you to see this. Some of it here up on the screen. 2 Peter chapter 2. Verse 4, we'll begin there. And it says, "For if God spared not the angels that," what does it say? Okay. Obviously, looks like angels can sin here. And their natures are very different from ours in many respects. So it says, for if God did not spare the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them unto chains of darkness, to be reserved unto judgment. Verse 5, "And spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly, and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them with an overthrow, making them an ensample unto those that after should live ungodly." So in an unbroken connection, it moves from the angels to the humans before the flood, and then to the humans after the flood. All right, and so you find that there, the angels that sinned, he didn't spare them. He didn't spare the ancient world. Why? Because they sinned, and he turned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes. Why? Because they sinned. So it must mean that the transgression of the law is really the only definition that you can apply universally here. Now, angels didn't sin because of the same reason that the children of Adam sin today. They didn't have the same natures that we do. They weren't affected by sin like we are as a result of what Adam did. There was not a weakening of their nature. There was not anything like that took place. So they didn't have that, yet they still sinned. By the way, Adam and Eve didn't have that, and they sinned also. So this idea that we sin because we have this nature is not really the truth on this universal sense. And even if God were to remove that nature from us right now, it still wouldn't solve the problem. We need a change of mind is what we need. So that's what we need, is the change of mind. Let this mind be in you, which was in Christ Jesus. Yes, there's a comment back there.
Wouldn't the common denominator be Satan? That's where the sin is at. He was the one that, pulled a third of the angels in with him, and that's why they were cast out. Okay, and he's the one that, tempted Eve and, got the ball rolling down here. So isn't he the common denominator?
He's the instigator, but once the Lord set the record straight, everyone had a choice in the matter, just like he sets the record straight for us today. Yeah, once that record was set straight, they decided to buy his version of the great controversy, then they pretty much went headlong in his direction after that, once all the light had been started. But the only point I'm trying to make here is that these were, I mean, you have children, and how many of you have ever educated your child to beat on another child because they have the toy that your child wanted? How many of you say, look, this is what you do when they're not looking, you just go ahead and deck them and then take the toy? I mean, most parents don't do that. How is it that the kids know how to do that? So, I mean, how do they know how to do that? How do they know how to act in such a violent, in such a violent way? The only thing I'm trying to say is that the devil didn't have that. The angels didn't have that. They weren't being pulled constantly like in the wrong direction, like you and I are, because of the nature that we have. And so just simply correcting this, and I hope my words are making sense, because I know that some of these things are, we make a whole bunch of assumptions on the basis of some of these words, so I'm trying to articulate them as clearly as I can. But they didn't have what you and I have, because some people say that, that is the cause of sin. Your sinful nature is the cause of sin. But it really isn't on a universal level. It is not. So that just tells you just how good the devil is. That he can do such a job that sinless intelligences are buying into the program. Now, if that's the case, then you and I are no match for him. No match for him, right? And so, now, if sin is the transgression of the law, and that is really the only definition that will apply to angels, I mean, because they don't sin because of their nature, then we just need to understand that there's a difference between a cause and a condition. So we have a condition, but that's not really the cause of our sin. The cause of our sin is when Jesus shows us right from wrong, and then we go ahead and do wrong. That's when he holds us accountable there. In John chapter 3, this is the condemnation, that light has come into the world, but men love darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. So that is the cause. When we're shown the difference and we choose the wrong path, that is it. There's also a difference between, just before I go to that, in order to run you need oxygen, right? But is oxygen the cause of running? No, it's not the cause of running. So, right? But it's an indispensable condition for sure. So there's just a difference between a condition and a cause. So I do have this nature, but it's not the cause. It is not the cause. There's a difference between a sinful nature and sinful thoughts and actions. This needs to be clear as well. Sinful thoughts are things that we actually indulge in, that we're guilty of. Just like it says in James chapter 1. If we go to James for a moment, we're in Peter, Hebrews, James chapter 1, verse 13. Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man, but every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Now in verse 15 it says, then when lust has, it says, conceived. Very interesting language there. In order for a baby to be born, the sperm must meet the egg, and then conception. You're going to have a baby. So the lustful thought must be combined with the mind saying, yes, that's what I want. And then, once that happens, you're going to have a baby. In other words, in due time, yet that sin will manifest itself in the outward actions. That's the baby. So there's a difference between sinful nature and sinful thoughts and actions, and there's a difference between sin and temptation as well. The Bible talks about the flesh, and then it talks about the works of the flesh, and they're not the same. So just having flesh is not sufficient to damn you to hell, like Augustine and some of the other church fathers would have us to believe. All right. All right. Okay. Now, the implications of a universal church, sinful nature is not the cause. Okay, I'm just repeating myself here. Willful transgression of the law of God is the universal cause. In other words, one that applies to both humans and angels. All right. Any other thoughts or questions on that? Observations? Okay. I'm sorry? Skip is talking about genetics. Yeah, you got the mic there.
Well, we have 6,000 years of degradation in our genes and chromosomes, and so while the nature isn't the cause of sin, it's the fuel for it, maybe.
Yes, and outside of Christ, for many people, yes. Socrates said that if you remove ignorance from people, then everyone is going to do the right thing. So yeah, most of us are laughing. No, you can show a person the right thing. No guarantee at all that they're going to do that. So he's basically saying you just remove ignorance and educate them, and everything will be all right. But no, there's something within us that overpowers that thing. And many of us can share from our own experience many times where we knew what the right thing to do was. We understood the consequences, but what did we do? We went ahead and did it anyhow. Okay? We went ahead and did it anyhow. And it wasn't until we were so sorry for what we did that we stopped. What's that, the children's stories?
Children's stories are always those kind of stories.
Ah, yeah.
Knowing that.
Yes, right. But yeah, so yes, genetics does a lot, and outside of Christ, yes, that is the cause. No, there's something within us that even though, and this is so perfectly described in Romans chapter 7, just a few verses where the apostle really lets us know that in verse 18, for I know that in me, that is in my flesh, dwells no good thing. Notice, for to will is present with me, but how to perform that which is good, I find not. Right? So he's saying, I can make a decision. I can say, I'm never going to do this thing again. All right. And then you're overcome. Because there is a law working, there is something working in you, actually. That's what he refers to in verse, 23? I see another law in my members warring against the law of my mind and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin. And so when ignorance meets that law, then, ignorance is just trampled upon. It's just, so we could be educated, but no, this thing in our members is moving us in a certain direction against God's law and warring against it. And the only solution to that is chapter 8, verse 1, there is therefore now no condemnation to them which are where? In. Think about that as a residence. Where do you live? Okay, we all have a physical residence that we go to, where our home is. But here it says, to them which are in Christ Jesus, that needs to be our residence. Whenever I think of that, I think about the cities of refuge in the Old Testament. If you had killed someone accidentally, then you would flee to that city, and you would be, as long as you were in that city, you were safe. But if you ventured outside, then the avenger could take you out. If we run into the city, if we run into Christ, if we run into the presence of God, if we run into His Word, it says we are safe. Now, the devil can harass and annoy and do all that kind of stuff, but he can't overpower our mind in this sense. I think, Holly, did you have a...
Yeah, so you said in Christ Jesus, and having previously said that the church is where Jesus is. I mean, that's where He's ministering. That's where He's receiving tithes. We're His body. Ephesians says He's the head, we're the body. So if we're in Jesus, that's the same as saying we're in His church.
Right.
Like attached
Yes.
and involved and... Yeah.
Yes, because the body outside of the head doesn't, yes. Yeah, Steve had a comment back there. If we can get back to him, and then I'll need to land the plane.
So Christ is in the sanctuary. That's where he is now. So when we're talking about being in Christ Jesus, that's where we need to focus our minds, which is what you centered this around, more or less.
Yes.
But also, okay, so the sinful thought whizzes through my brain. I then start to agree with it, then I cooperate with it, and then I commit it.
Mm-hmm.
If I run to the sanctuary, that's not going to happen where Christ is.
Yes. Yeah, we fight it one thought at a time. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down, it says, imaginations, which is like reasonings, and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. So if we will do that, then yes, help will come from the sanctuary. So we'll end on that note. Psalm chapter 20. Notice this. Psalm chapter 20. And Ezra, Psalm 18. Okay. It says, the Lord hear thee in the day of trouble. The name of the God of Jacob defend thee. Send thee help from the sanctuary and strengthen thee out of Zion. So that's what the Lord wants to do for each and every one of us. And so, all right, I think that was Psalm 20, verse 1. Yep. So send thee help from the sanctuary. All right, well, why don't we have a word of prayer as we wrap this up?